Welcome to Left on Red, where a Gen X mom and gay millennial do socialism.
We've got left wing views on news you can use.
I'm Scott,
I'm Susan.
and today we have a esteemed member of Democratic Socialists of America, David Dualday. I was going to say the Dualday.
You said it perfectly. I
What are you
appreciate
doing all day?
Yeah,
Socialism.
it. Thank
and
you. Socialism all day.
we're here to find out what he's been doing all day.
Okay.
David recently is out with this article in, I guess, the Socialist Majority Caucus newsletter.
No, I would say our party paper, our factional
Our
paper.
publication,
A
Your
publication, the
publication,
agitator.
the Agitator. We love
which
that.
we don't sell, which is very important to note.
Yeah, your free digital publication for the caucus. And your article is kind of about the history and importance of the DSA convention. And this is really topical because DSA convention nationally is coming up in about 2 months. And all of us are waiting to find out if we're elected delegate or, who we're running right here in New York City. We're going to find out tomorrow, which obviously is as of this recording, this will probably be out already, who gets to be delegate here in New York. David and I are running. Susan is not.
I'm not running, so you know.
I'm running. Wow, my gosh.
We have diversity, okay?
Yeah,
It's your turn, buddy.
I've been at the last 2 conventions.
I know, but I've been
And I
at
was
many.
at,
I was
at
at
the
many
two
before that.
those.
So yeah, let's get into it. There's a couple of there's like 2 big through lines of what you wrote. And the first is kind of you wanted to talk a little bit about history, especially before, when I say I was at 2 conventions, I was at the 2 last ones, and they were like increasingly more relevant as the organization was growing a lot larger and so on. But you were really talking about a little bit of pre-2017, but mostly you were talking about 2017 and on. And so would love to tell us a little bit about the history aspect, and then we'll get into the more politically biased retellings of some of the last 2 and the results of those conventions.
How about just the political contentions of the convention? I prefer that
Yeah,
because they were not without controversy.
Thank you. Reasonable differences. And I think as Scott asked me to, he said the good thing about history is interesting, but we should also keep it spicy. But we'll talk a little bit first about I guess bland, if for Scott, his takes. But the DSA conventions, have been happening since 1982. I think it's important to remember the first one was actually the merger convention in 82. So that's but since then they've been held in even years. So that was when the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee and the New American Movement came together to birth our lovely organization as it is. And so the reason why I focus in my piece on saying that conventions in my time were not important or didn't have the same, I would just say, magnitude of influence and impact on U.S. politics or local politics was because I wasn't there for the older conventions. But I don't want to kind of erase that history. That's really important events. And there were moments that were harbingers. They were things that now we can look back on that were super important, like the 2007 convention when Bernie Sanders spoke. Was the last time Bernie addressed a DSA convention. He's addressed 3. That was a lot of young people came to that, and it was kind of like us still staying relevant to U.S. politics. But largely, it's really hard to undersell these events because they were talking about some of these conventions. I was in rooms with 60 people, maybe 80. Towards the 2010s, it was 100 or so. So, these were national gatherings that had fewer people than some DSA, general membership meetings. It just wasn't that important for the membership to go. The elections were largely uncontested, for the NPC, often unlike now where the national leadership is truly a dynamic contest for different tendencies. It was okay, who showed up? Can we convince them to run? And often there were the vacancies were due to the quotas for racial groups and gender, which are good quotas to have, but they did also lead to these. But there weren't just enough people running. So that's why my history focused on when DSA changed, even though I'm a big defender, as people who've read my stuff, of let's not forget about the old DSA. I think it's important to be honest about when things change. And so I felt that it was also key to note that the 2017 convention, which I think Susan and I were both at, I was still on the DSA staff at the time, was more of what I described as a housekeeping event, and I say that in a total like it's just what it was. It was like the organization needed to change in certain ways that were not as controversial. They may seem controversial at the time, but like getting rid of the vice chairs and honorary chairs, like think positions that like had long since been outdated, no longer had relevance to the new DSA. The joining the BDS as like a signer on, like that, like the boycott, divestments, and sanctions, like shifting that, leaving the Social International, which I personally oppose, but I understand. But I think you can look back on now being like, it didn't make sense for DSA to be in this global association of social democratic parties when it was becoming much more radical. So I think that was important there too. And then we can get into like when it really starts, you seeing this contestation, which I think we're going to see in 2025 between those who want to do like mass politics, as I would define it broadly, and then those who want a more insular, kind of smaller, more I would argue more sectarian DSA. And those fights kind of take different shapes, but they happen starting more in 2019 than in 2017. Though I do say note you do see the kind of beginnings of that in 2017.
Now, we all, for political honesty, I think all three of us here identify as part of the mass politics wing. So I'm going to play the role of the other side to be charitable.
So he almost is the guy in class who says, well, to play devil's advocate.
Yeah. I want to.
Yeah, just to like piss me off.
I want to be supportive of people that aren't here to raise the other perspective. And so I think they might frame it as trying to develop some level of internal political cohesion and organizational, like often those people are supportive of what we call like a political program, essentially a few lines or a central platform that DSA can kind of say, this is what we believe in, and have some level of structure and boundary around that. So this is how you sort of frame 2019, 2021, 2023, and then 2025 in this article. I said 2019 earlier, I was incorrect. I was at 2021 and 2023. I was barely in the organization in 2019. And there's some interesting stuff that you write about. I'm kind of curious. It sort of reads the same. I don't know if you think you'd have the same analysis. 2021, 2023 seem to have sort of the same struggles around structure for an eventual independent party. That seems to be like this constant debate and discussion that we're having, and also how we treat elected leadership versus staff leadership, and also some like political lines, whether or not we expel or censure elected officials for certain actions or political beliefs, or we leave those things more flexible. Do you feel like any of those debates resolved at any point? Do you think they are resolving? Do you think all of those arguments are going to come back again in 2025?
So you touched upon something that I think that is important in the analysis that I wrote. But first I want to take a step back and say that what we're going through is very normal and, frankly, in some ways healthy for a democratic organization. And that I've been doing research on another project looking at the Socialist Party of Debs and Norman Thomas, who are like the leaders, kind of presidential candidates of that era, and the DSA of today. And I think a big difference I noticed between DSA today and the DSA I joined in is like I can be honest now and say like the DSA joined was essentially a democratic sect. It was like as I mentioned, there were elections. People ran, people like stepped away. So it was a democratic organization that wasn't like a cult, like when you think of like smaller organizations. But there wasn't that big a range of opinions. Like people more or less had like consensus on things, and we are returning much more to like what the Socialist Party was, which was like people with really different ideas about how to get to socialism under one umbrella, and fighting and contesting about those different strategies and approaches. The 2019 convention, you're correct. And what I maybe wasn't clear enough about, but I can give a very simple answer if you were there, was like that was the horizontal versus vertical convention. That was like, is DSA going to be like a horizontal organization where like the power is really devolved to the chapters? There's a nominal national staff that are just doing completely bureaucratic, like sending out lists, like not doing anything much more than like the most basic administrative roles? Or do you want an organization that's vertical, where there's the staff, where you want to build a big staff, want to have a dynamic national political committee that's giving directions, that is connected to like at that time the big question was the Bernie Sanders second presidential run. So that was resolved, in my opinion, that largely like we have an organization with voting formally and with our feet have chosen the vertical model. So that is settled. What is then not settled, and I think is like a big shift in certain ways, but also not, and I can get into that later as we talk more about accountability and these electoral resolutions, like, is the largely like, what's the role of staff versus the elected leadership? I think we're reaching a consensus that we want the elected leadership to have more and more day-to-day power, but that's like still like needs to get resolved. But I think, but I think the bigger debate, because I think there's more of a consensus there, that's more like in the implementation stages that we're figuring out. The more, because is how do you become a party? Is it, see, or I would say, is that even possible? But then you get to more than how does that actually look in reality? And I think that is where we are in this constant. You could be overly fancy dialectic fight, but I actually think it's like multipolar. I think there's lots of different views of people trying to kind of struggle together.
Can I ask you really quick? You said you think the horizontal versus vertical debate is kind of decided.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't around for 2019, so maybe I don't know the valence of that. But I don't even know if I think that's correct.
Okay.
When we do the DSA 101s, for example, here in New York City DSA, when people ask me about national, I usually just tell them like, yeah, it exists. It's kind of whatever. I think we feel an extremely non-existent connection to national. If you asked me if I preferred whether or not national existed or not, I would say, I don't know. I kind of don't care. I don't really understand the connection. And to me, that sort of indicates that maybe we voted for a vertical structure, but in reality, it hasn't really grasped hold. So long as we're not a democratic centralist organization, the extent to which national exists and does anything is just kind of like a friendly, encouraging partner rather than a leadership body. But do you feel differently? Do you feel national? I mean, think about it. One of the things that you write about is that DSA is NPC, unendorsed AOC, but here in New York City DSA, we continue to endorse AOC. To me, that's a horizontalist organization. I'm happy about us endorsing AOC, of course, but what do you think that says about that debate? It feels like it's still going on.
Yeah, I mean, I disagree with you, and I think it's a disagreement that's based in nuance, but I don't take your view. I think I have 2 points. So one is I use the word magnitude, like, so about other debates. So like, very quick sidebar, like I argue, and I'm going to argue in this other thing I'm writing that we'll talk about another time, like the labor question actually has largely been settled. And that like, but if you look at the Socialist Party, because like whatever debates we have about labor strategy in DSA, and we have contested elections for the National Labor Commission, which also pushes back against your national doesn't matter because people do still contest for these spots. But that aside, we have the big questions 100 years ago was like, what labor federation will we create? Will it be the IWW, which is like the anarchists? Is it like going to be, or do we want to be the left wing of the American Federation of Labor? Do we want to create another totally socialist labor federation? Huge differences of opinion. So like the magnitude in 2019 that you weren't there for was a bigger difference. It was like literally, it was like, are we going to have this like assembly of locals that would have been, in my opinion, incredibly undemocratic, where New York and a small chapter would have had equal say in this Senate? Like that is different than what you are describing as DSA is an American organization. The DSA is a federated organization, which I think is actually the thing people is kind of one of the elephants in the room is that we're an organization that almost wants to be like a European social democratic party in the most traditional Marxist sense, but we exist in a federated structure where power is devolved to the cities and states, which makes it like very difficult to have a unified program, which is why like, and I want to hear from Susan too, I don't want to just do all the talking, but I think like getting to your point is like why like when we're getting to the mass for sectarian, why the like unified endorsement proposal at the convention I would view as sectarian. Even if it's not their intention, they're like, we should have a central program with like one type of endorsement. But the local conditions in this country are so different that having a centralized like standard for endorsement coming from national that everyone has to agree with doesn't really make sense. It makes sense what we do now, which is like, as you said, the chapter can endorse AOC and then the national can reaffirm that to send a message which has some importance for national politics, both not just for DSA, but also for like what other people see. But so I just think it's a magnitude question, in my opinion, about why this is like, why that debate has been settled. And now you're getting into like the implementation parts and the structural barriers.
Yeah, I mean, in my mind, I was in 2017 and I was in 2019. And 2019 was the big. I also did 2021 as a virtual participant in Stylianos' living room. That was the most fun I've ever had at a DSA convention. 2017 was just like I was very confused because I was pretty new to the org. There was controversy around the NPC, shall we say, and I wasn't part of a caucus. And I met all these people online from different DSA locals who all had very different priorities. And it seemed like to me the big fight was like supporting small locals of small chapters versus like the hegemony of large chapters. And it felt like that is a bigger fight. And it seems to be a structural argument, but it often turns out to be an ideological argument because the smaller chapters tend to be more horizontal in their ideological orientation. So like their idea of a DSA chapter tends to be more like mutual aid oriented and horizontal and sort of like we don't really tell anybody what to do. We just kind of like people show up and we do a DSA. Maybe we'll have a brake lights clinic and maybe we'll do like, you know, some mutual aid, but they're not necessarily electoral or political. Like to me, I'm a political scientist, right? So that means you engage with the state. But I think a lot of smaller chapters, not all, but some, when they don't have the numbers or their like local conditions aren't useful for a electoral program, are more likely to have sort of a kind of like a cultural kind of program, like where they want to have like social impact, but they're not necessarily explicitly political. And that's, they're not interested in engaging with the state, right? Because the state they engage with might be like triple Republican, you know, red state, red town. So they have different goals. And so in my mind, that's what I saw the conflicts as, right? Like what should we be prioritizing? Where should there be redistribution of dues and staff time? That's the biggest fights that I would see. I remember something called Pass the Hat, which was that 2021, right?
It was 20. No, it was 2019. I mentioned in the
2019, and
article.
it was about trying to do this redistribution model towards these smaller chapters. But like the thing is, DSA, our greatest weakness is also our greatest strength, right? Like this very, you can call it decentralized, you can call it whatever. We're diffuse, right? Like the way we do power in politics is very diffused, and it depends on local conditions. It depends on like chapter characteristics. And so like they have this like phrase they say, like when you see this kind of neurodiverse person, you've met one, right? So if you know one DSA chapter, you know one DSA chapter, you can generalize across them, but they're so different. And practices and like policies and like strategies, they emerge kind of organically. And you know, people move around between different chapters and we like to learn from each other. But to me, it's like we're a beautiful mess. And there's a fight over like, okay, we do have these structures, we do have these resources, we do have this name recognition, but we don't know how to use it. And large chapters can kind of ignore it because we don't need them. Like our ability to raise money kind of exceeds national's ability to raise money. Like our reach politically in our area matters a lot more than national, right? So we kind of, because that power is diffuse, it operates very differently. And which is not to say I don't sympathize with the smaller chapter or people who have more of this mutual aid or like cultural movement approach, but it reflects a lot of the fights that we saw in Occupy, which is like a lot of people are like, their politics are like, we reject the state. We think it's disgusting. Again, I understand and sympathize with that position, and we will not engage with it. And that includes a rejection of the Democrats, a rejection of electoralism. And those fights come up in national, and they're not going to be resolved because we are a diffuse organization. Basically, numerically, I believe, and I've never seen like survey data, I think the vast majority of dues-paying DSA members fall under the mass politics category. Like we come here because we like Bernie. We come here because we hate Trump. But the people who put in the most time and organize may not reflect numerical majorities, right? And I think that that's sort of a challenge that we have in DSA. We see it when we do things like a mass survey of DSA, NYC DSA chapter members about should we endorse AOC? And it's like, I don't know who said it, putting up Assad level numbers, right? But if you looked at debates, you would think it was 50-50.
I like how we're having our own convention debate rather than discussing, but that's good. I think, you know, Susan, I really feel what you just said about, you know, one DSA chapter just means you know one DSA chapter. And I'm beginning to think that's not a good thing. And I'm really torn personally. And we should move on from this topic because we should get to the actual convention discussions. But it really does for me, and like we're reviving here what David is saying is totally resolved, the horizontalism. But it really feels to me, on the one hand, I love the benefit of New York City is able to kind of do what we want to do, kind of unshackled from many other chapters that have different political conditions. But likewise, it's very tough for a random tweet from a random chapter to go up about God knows what, and then everyone in New York State to like latch onto that and put stories out about that and say this is the DSA. And then I'm sure other chapters or get really frustrated with us when we do something that they really don't agree with, and then they feel that it's representative of them. So on the one hand, I really love being able to do whatever we want. On the other hand, I recognize that, like, you know, far be it from me to say, sometimes a little democratic centralism feels like it would be useful. But we should move on from our own convention debate here and get into kind of the later part of what you were saying, David, which is talking about the more recent conventions and some of the decisions. And you're saying that there's this maybe not necessarily dialectic or maybe multipolar dialectic around the party question. How are you seeing that so far? Tell us, what are the resolutions coming up for 2025 in which that's going to be kind of active?
Yeah, and I will say I did find that other part fascinating, and I think I could go on about the sociology and anthropology of DSA, but let's save that for another show. But I will say one thing just before we go on, you can cut it. But what's the difference? While you may see only one DSA chapter, by being a national organization, the ability to then like move and go know which chapter you're going to is like very rare in politics. You can't do that in like our revolution and like a lot of other organizations. So there is a central identity, which even if there is dispersed ways that it is implemented. But so one thing that I think I want to get to, which I want to talk, then it'll be a better way to then jump into the resolutions, is like that mass and sectarianism to me is not like a binary. It's not like things can easily fit into a box and you're like, that's mass, and obviously that's totally sectarian, can't everyone tell. And I think like a good way to think about the resolutions too is like, I think like back in the day it would have made sense, it would have been sectarian for DSA to say we're only going to endorse socialists because there are so few socialists running. Like we're talking about DSA when I joined having like 12 people who were held office, so it made sense to like for the DSA electoral process to be much more ecumenical. Now because we go so deep into these races that it's this question of resources, so it becomes a very pragmatic question that DSA would only endorse socialists, and it's not a sectarian position. So and I think it's important then to look not to when you're looking at electoral questions. For right now, I think the mass and sectarian divide is more about like who are the people which we are orienting around. And I think so for me, mass politics is not just, if we're talking about in this case, it's like broadly, which what Susan was talking about earlier, it's like most people I believe in DSA, like what Susan believes, like are very interested in defeating Donald Trump and his agenda. And that is not really reflected a lot in DSA's day-to-day politics coming from national and on down. And I think there's like, DSA is not endorsing like the No King's Day on June 14th. That's like a lot that my union and other unions are backing, that Indivisible is backing, that's going to be thousands of people like building off like the hands off. And so you see these kind of tensions happening through the resolution. So like there's the SMC does have like a defeat Trump resolution, but there weren't that many. I didn't see any others. But you would see these resolutions like, let's build a united front, so you're like, that sounds great. And then you see the united front is with like PSL and these other very small socialist groups. And that's what I'm talking about, the divisions, where it's like, there's nothing inherently wrong with working with like smaller socialist groups, but it's like, what does the political moment now require? It requires like defeating this like fascistic Republican agenda and being with the people who are doing that. And right now, what I'm seeing is, which was like this great advice I learned a few years ago, but it's like right now DSA is like 2 steps ahead of the masses. And that means like, we're like just way too ahead of them, where you really want to be 1 step ahead. So you're leading them, but you still know where they are. And I think those are the kind of resolutions. Like, I don't want to we can go down the line and talk about more, but I think like kind of like the single endorsement one, like is an example of that, where it's like a very inward focus that would really limit the ability for like New York to like endorse AOC, because it would be like, there has to be one standard and you can't endorse people, and that elected can't endorse people we don't like. And then you have this united front, and I could go on. But it's also, if you just look at the number, like what are the topics? Like there's very few topics that are about like actually mass politics outside of, I think, like labor. And a lot of the electoral questions are like really trying to figure out accountability, trying to figure out like how do we get to a party, which are important questions to have, and the convention is the perfect place to have them. But I always say that what makes them, and what I said on the forum, it's the degree of sectarianism is like, where is your emphasis? Your emphasis on is like the most important thing for me is like figuring out these internal programmatic questions and not relating to fighting the oligarchy. That's sectarian. Whereas like if there's more of a balance, that's when then there's a role for mass politics.
I really appreciate this analysis. I haven't been paying attention to the resolutions. I've been on this side of mass politics since the beginning of my career, my tenure at DSA as a member. And so I joined in January 2017. You could call me part of the Trump bump, right? Like for me, being part of the DSA is different than being part of the hashtag resistance and the liberals who are anti-Trump, because they want to solve a problem, but they don't have a roadmap of where to go. So we're all anti-Trump. Like we're all part of a broad anti-Trump. We can call it a united front, anti-fascist agenda. My experiences in like the hashtag resistance movement, which are plentiful. So if people want to accuse me of being a lib, that's legit. I've spent a lot of time in these circles, but like at the same time, the DSA difference is that we're saying what the world and our society and our politics and our economics could look like. And our job is to be convincing to a broad range of people to create this democratic majority, this socialist majority of people who say, yes, it's not enough to just be anti-Trump. Because if we keep going back to what the Democrats do, we're going to get a repeat. Maybe we could win one presidential term and a couple of Democratic, majorities in the House and Senate, but we're just going to go back. Like we're going to become like I flipped out. All right, I'm going a little bit off topic here, but I flipped out after Labor won because I was like telling friend of the pod, Jonathan, I was like, this is a blip. Like this is just a temporary a blip. You've not solved the problem of the fascist rise in England. He's like, Susan, there were parts of, the UK that voted for Labor for the first time in centuries. That's like, imagine Alabama voting for someone like AOC. And I was just like, ugh. Like he was so pleased. Not that there's anything wrong with being happy. I was happy too, but like, what did Labor offer us? Like, okay, we're gonna be soft on this. We're gonna bend towards the anti-migrant sentiment. They didn't offer us much of anything except for that they were not the conservative party. And the Democrats continue to also say, we're not the Republicans, we're not Trump. And then they lose these opportunities to have bold change. I mean, arguably, like in many ways, President Biden did offer some like bold suggestions, but it was always kind of like still very much within a very market-oriented capitalist framework. And then everybody else in the party too continue to say we're not socialists. So the Democrats want to hate on socialists, and the Republicans want to take their radical fascists and young like right-wing leaders and amplify them, like make a deep backbench. And we literally have geriatric people dying, so they can't vote against things like the big bill. And like, so to me, I can't with full sympathy to their deep ethical commitments, like I can't take seriously people who want to make DSA the only organization that wants to be a mass socialist organization into a sectarian one. Like we have those organizations already. If your goal is purity, then like they would love to have you. I just don't understand I'm gonna make a lot of enemies here. That's okay. Nobody likes me that much at work either. There's already great organizations that do some really good work, like organizing mass protests and being present and doing certain kinds of information sharing. Like I met a lot of good friends in ISO, like when they were leafleting and selling newspapers outside of a grocery store. Like, so they all occupy important lanes, but they cannot be mass socialist organizations.
Let me offer the missing perspective here, and maybe if you are one of the representatives of the missing perspective, let us know. We can have a follow-up episode. Obviously, I'm on this side that has just been spoken. But I'm also sympathetic to the sense that, in the one sense, mass politics requires some level of, I don't want to say flexibility, but openness to political perspectives. But I am sympathetic to the idea that if we're trying to convince people of our politics, of our organization, we do need to have some coherent level of politics. And so let's take the most common and popular debate, anti-Zionism, right? The ways in which AOC, who I support, was not great on the question of Israel and Palestine did muddy the political perspective for a bit. If you were following her and you were watching what was happening in Gaza, so assume you're just a random person, you're seeing this stuff on social media and you're feeling kind of angry at Joe Biden, angry at the American government, you would be kind of confused and upset with AOC, who is better than 99% of American leaders on this issue, for saying things like he's working tirelessly for a ceasefire and supporting him so hard. And saying simultaneously there's a genocide happening and also saying, well, we have to support Joe Biden, whatever. And there's tension in that. So I'm sympathetic to the idea that clarifying that position and having some semblance of a line where we can say, DSA is firmly anti-Zionist, and this action, this endorsement, whatever, isn't allowed in our organization, is appealing to a sense of doing mass politics, because then all these people that agree and believe in that, would say, okay, DSA can be my political home. That's what I think folks would say is why we don't necessarily need to have like the smallest, most narrow political vision. This is exactly how to do it. But we do need we could use stronger boundaries around our political ideas in general. And sometimes I'm sympathetic to that, I think.
Yeah, and I think what I would respond to that, because I think you're giving a very good faith interpretation of what our comrades would say, and I think that
We love to see it. So
we love
it's
to
very,
see it.
very generous.
I think I genuinely
No,
agree with that.
no, and I
Yeah.
think I agree with that too. And what I'm getting at is that this is what the one value that, even though it drives us crazy at times, is like that these questions will be decided democratically is really important, and that we don't want unanimity completely. That's why I was saying, like, I look back on my time in the old DSA with fondness, but there was unanimity. It was just like broadly, like, people all felt the same thing more or less, and that's not how you.
But clearly not, though, right? Like a lot of these folks left in 2023 because they were like, no, we can't be part of an organization.
No, okay, but they are holding on to what were the core values of that very narrow organization. So that narrow organization did, and they're not willing. And I said, like, the difference between them and I've stressed before is like I am like willing to be in the minority. I'm willing to like still advocate for my position, and that you have to just recognize the organization has changed, and that there's actually lots. And this is getting to like why conventions matter, which is like the name of the article. It's like, but you have to be willing to fight for those positions. You can't just be like, okay, well, I'm the minority now, so I don't want to be part of this. And so I think the people who are advancing their version of anti-Zionist politics have a right to do it. I think it gets bad when it's like, no, oh, you're a Zionist. And like in that word, the problem is like, if I'm going to, my hot take is like, the term Zionism can kind of lose meaning in some of these discourses where people who are not Zionists at all get labeled like that. And that's when it gets too hot, and it becomes, and the very fairness of like, we should have more standards, people should be more clear, especially elected officials should be held accountable, can get too muddied. And I think that's the balance that this all has to take. And that I think that you can also, though, have an honest conversation that, like, I went door to door for 4 days during the end of the 2024 election. Gaza came up, I think, once or twice. There were lots of voters who had lots of other opinions. It's like there's just people, the American voters have lots of different opinions, and you have to create a movement that can both address the genocide in Gaza and also address other things people are saying. And it's possible to do both. And I think, but it takes a strategy and orientation to make it work. It's not just to be like, well, yes, I care about everything. Like, that's not a strategy. That's also what made the old DSA really ineffective, was like just saying, we care about everything. Okay, then the converse of what Susan is saying too, of like, there are already sectarian groups out there for you. It's like, well, there's already goody two-shoe NGOs I could do if I care about sweatshop labor. Why should I do it in DSA if DSA just cares about everything? You have to have, it's a balance that we have to take, and the conventions matter because they do set the direction of like the national leadership, which sets a tone, which people need to admit. Even Stelianos can be like, well, New York is different, but for lots of other chapters who depend on the staff a lot more than we do because they don't have their own staff and are really looking for political direction, what the NPC says matters. It does. Because it gets on the news. It sets a tone, like what happened recently with the shooting of the embassy workers, and the NPC had a not unanimous vote, but said like, we were against the shooting of the embassy workers. That's like an important decision that matters.
Let's get into that, because I actually, I kind of don't think it matters. And I'm not speaking just from a New York City perspective, but I think staff and NPC was this huge debate last year, right? Oh God, I can't believe it was only a year ago.
Brother, it's been a debate at like
the
all
budget
of them.
debate.
Oh, yes. Specifically, those staff in the fiscal crisis, yes.
But there was this huge fight between essentially SMC and Groundwork and Red Star and Mug, and then BNR kind of on the anti-staff for the budget part. Enormous fight, really big battle, and I was very publicly kind of on the BNR and Mug and Red Star side of this, actually. We should, admitting my bias going in, I was very not interested in preserving staff in the budget as much as SMC and Groundwork were. So maybe I'm coming to this from bias, but it's really notable that there was a lot of And again, we're kind of relitigating debates here, which I wish we were talking more about convention in general, but let's relitigate the debates. It's fun. There was this big contention that if we got rid of these staff, the organization would fall apart, it would collapse, whatever. And that didn't happen. And in fact, we've grown substantially since then. And it's not because we grew because we got rid of staff. We grew because Donald Trump got elected.
I was hoping you would say that.
Yeah.
Then I would have been on it.
Yeah. But that's taking me to that higher level position of, regardless of the political faction makeup of our NPC over the last 5 years, and regardless of what decisions we make at convention, the most core part of DSA to me, which is, are we organizing more socialists, more people, seems to be rising and falling in response to external events outside of our control. The election of Joe Biden, Israeli genocide in Gaza, like all these other things to which we are responding to, right? We are protesting. People see DSA. We're getting people elected at the local level, and so people see their local chapter. Mid-Hudson Valley is a great example where they're growing faster than every other chapter in the country at extreme rates because of their super great organizing success. But it seems like our membership numbers, our political successes at the local level, all of these things happen regardless of what's going on at national. So convince me that national and convention really matters and sets a tone, given all of these trends seem to not care who's on the NPC.
Okay, so I'll give you one microcosm and then I'll give more a real argument. But like, I went to the website today because I had to I think either to prep for this or some reason. And the DSA website still has not been updated with that statement I just mentioned. It's on Twitter. So when you fire your comms director, you can't actually update your website so people know what's going on. And I think that we have to take a step back too and realize like DSA communications, DSA activity are not just for DSA members and the broad working class. They're also for people who are watching, political actors, and if you don't have a functioning organization that can actually communicate that, that's not a good thing. But taking one historical example, being, I will self-aggrandizing somewhat, but also why conventions matter, is like the 2015 DSA convention said we are endorsing Bernie Sanders and are going to develop a program around that. Whereas other social organizations didn't do that. And one thing I do push back on a lot from when I've been very critical of the old DSA in this conversation, but like when people say like it was just an accident that DSA blew up, that is not true. We really plan to relate to the Bernie movement, to build infrastructure, to have things in place. And we were ready for that movement in the way like committees of we can name them committees of correspondence and Progressive Democrats of America, who were basically the same size as us in 2015 and 2016, just weren't ready, and we're the ones who benefited. And that debate happened again in 2019 and there was people who didn't want to endorse Bernie. And if DSA didn't endorse Bernie, it wouldn't have caught on to that second wave. So I'm totally with you that there are, and I always point out there are the external factors, but if you don't have some orientation towards like or people who are willing to be oriented, and we can have a counterfactual. Could we be even bigger if we were at present more of these rallies? I don't know. You don't know. It's a counterfactual, but it's one that's a real question. It's not like definitely not. It's just all external factors. So it does matter because it's ultimately, if you look back, it's like it sets a tone that goes down. Yes, it's an American organization. That's what we all agree on here, in that like the local work will drive 99% of everything with some hyperbole. But the tones that get set are really important. Like the tone that like we changed our electoral strategy in 2019 to being towards the dirty break. That sets a lot of the debates, that influences. You can shake your head, but like these are debates that actually happen that influence then like how people get excited. So I'm not going to totally shift you if you're like staff don't matter, they don't matter in the aggregate, because there's certain truth to like it is what's happening, but these decisions do matter, and that's why I'm encouraging people. I mean, the people who have decided to run have run. I can't go because it's my partner's birthday, and I love her too much, and I won't miss it. But I do think it's important. That's why I'm doing this kind of work, because I do think like what happens at the national has an impact, whether you feel it right away or not. And I think the fight now is like, is it going to be an organization that's oriented towards a mass politics or not? Because history rhymes, and these battles have different like symmetries to them, or what were happening in New York to a certain extent too, or what other chapters will be happening in their places as well. So that's this is why it matters who's in office.
I mean, just on a very basic level, when National does stuff, it makes news. So we're not completely divorced, even in a large chapter like NYC DSA. And people like say things to me sometimes like, well, why did you guys not endorse AOC? I think the other thing too is like, I think that the most recent NPC, for whatever ideological or divisions they have, haven't really done enough to make us sort of very openly, publicly anti-Trump. Like, I think that that's a real mistake. It's all happening at the local level, which is great, but I think we're members of a national organization. So I think that there's potential to have a large impact when it comes to these sort of national level questions. Of course, we have the most impact on local level political questions because local politics are more accessible and they're where a lot of decisions are made. But I do think that the national organization is still like a force that is taken seriously by political observers. And I think for that reason alone, it's a little embarrassing that like DSA does so much locally, but nationally it's like we can't really think of what is it doing to resist the Trump administration in like a real obvious way. And so it's one of those things. It's like perhaps national could be more. And I don't have skin in the game in terms of this recent convention, but I'm very curious to see what happens. I know that a lot of caucuses are organizing, putting a lot of work into it because they do feel like a lot is at stake. Oh, sorry, like cat visit. And so I think that when we don't put a lot of effort into organizing mass politics into national, then the people who put the work in try to keep us hamstrung. That's also something to keep in mind as well. Like I was at Occupy, and I don't know if David was also there, but like what happened at Occupy was they would have these assemblies and you had to be there physically to participate. So the people with the most time, but not necessarily the best vision or necessarily best skill set, tended to be the ones that made all the decisions. And like that wasn't necessarily positive in terms of a development. Oh, this cat does not want to go down. And so I think that trying to make sure our national organization matches the ideological and political orientation of our membership, I think it's important to do. Any democratic organization, if we don't sort of make that effort, you're going to have a national organization that's very divorced from the realities of the locals, which means that the organization itself becomes less effective. In my union, for example, the kind of people who tend to work and get elected to leadership at this mid-tier body, but it's a very important political body, are much more strike-oriented than our regular membership. Our membership is not strike oriented, but they're also not organizing. So what they basically do is yell. And so now we're like, we got to do more. Even though most of the work at our union happens at local chapters of our union, if we don't work to keep the political leadership of our central union representative of the kinds of people who are active at the local level, that is going to be really bad. There's now this big disjuncture between what gets fought over at our like central level than what's actually happening on campuses. And that's not great. So I guess it kind of matches the way we have to run democratic organizations like unions. Really quickly, I remember I was like crying at one point and I was like, do I have to spend the rest of my life fighting with people I disagree with? And like my
Yes.
partner, yeah, he's like, that's what you have to do. And I was like, oh. And yeah, that's what we have to do. So we have to do it, whether it's in our unions, whether it's in our communities, or whether it's in DSA.
There's a really great quote from this woman who made a TikTok. She makes a bunch of TikToks. And I wish I remember her name, but it was about community specifically. And this video that she made was about whether or not straight people should be allowed at like the gay bar. It was a whole thing about community, but there was one line where she was like, think of the person you hate the most, or where they are. That's your community. It's like, that's so true. And because community means people you disagree with. I have a good question to wrap it up, because I maybe sort of am not fully convinced about the impact, but I am interested in the impact. By the way, Susan, I'll remind you that a lot of people who don't agree with our version of politics are listeners of the show, so we'll be nice and sweet to them.
Yeah, I mean, but they're welcome to come and talk on the show.
No, real, so
We're
real.
open.
Yeah, we have a political position sometimes, I agree. But let me ask a question that I'm actually thinking about, because we've talked a lot about the potential for national to have an impact and the reality where we sort of feel that it's not yet impactful. You guys are saying that it is in many ways, but you also recognize that, like, Susan, you made a statement, I don't know what national has done about Donald Trump recently. As a person who's not in any caucus, I have no idea what national has done at all after the budget debate. And I'm sure you guys are probably a little bit more plugged in because you're in a caucus, in a group chat where you might see a notification here and there and be like, oh, that's what they're up to. I have no clue as a regular, fairly involved DSA member. So what I'm curious about is, how can national be more impactful? What are some things that might be up for debate at this convention that someone like me, who feels that national right now is kind of whatever, but has an interest in positive impacts, or impacts I disagree with, but at least some more coherence and some power at the national level, what can we do? What can be done? What should be done for national to be a little bit more relevant to the lives of a DSA member like me, who's not in a caucus, who's not paying a lot of attention to internal politics?
Yeah, one way that I think Susan is really really hitting the nail on the head is I think that there is sometimes a desire when we're dealing with politics of people being like, well, how long do I have to vote for Democrats? I think we've talked about this before. It's like, well, you don't have to vote for them forever, but there's always going to be a right wing that we probably have to fight for, at least in the short term. So you're always going to be doing politics. And I think the sum up where I'm leading to with this is like, we need to have the impact where that version of doing politics, where it's like fighting the right, like overcoming the center, like the neoliberal wing of the Democratic parties, and building our own organizations and our own movement, all come together and all are one core thing. And so there's like different things that SMC is proposing. There's like showing socialist leadership in the anti-Trump movement, which is like not the idea that socialists will lead. I mean, that's one thing. But I think there's the electoral work we do. But I think the one thing I would focus on, which I think touches upon a lot of things that we care about as union members, as people who do electoral politics, and as New Yorkers, is like the efforts to like get more socialist union members to run for office. And that's something like an actual national program that is coordinated could have an impact. There shouldn't just be one Claire Valdez. There should be many Claire Valdezes, who's the STEM assembly member, who wasn't just a union leader and staffer. She was also active in the DSA chapter here. You know, that's how we all knew her. She wasn't just someone like me who happened to be a union member. She was like a real trade unionist. I think there's a difference between someone, though I'm a union member, just happens to run for office, and someone who was like truly active in their union. Though I am, sidebar, I am very active in a union. And I think
You're not a good example. You're very
yeah, I'm not a good example, but I was one. But there are people who, like me, I was one point I was just a member, and I think that's like, and going off my like long vision, like one of the more fun things about doing that Socialist Party history was like them talking about, or like seeing the guy who wrote "Why Is There's No Socialism in the U.S.," who was actually sympathetic to socialism. He's like, and there's these trade unionists throughout the land who are like running as social democrats and socialists, but you need a real program. It's not like you can't just have hope that it all works out, or just hope that the chapters do it, because there's not chapters who all have the same resources that New York does, or that DC does, or these large chapters. You want to bring together a coherent program that unites people, and that's what I think is where you would have the impact. Where you don't have the impact is like if all of our electoral discussions are like, are we censoring this person? Are we like, what are the red lines? Those are important conversations that belong in the convention, but they have to go along with, I think you're using the right word, impact. And the impact you would have is like, what is a way in which we're going to build DSA, build mass movements that also combat the right and make us like more vocal? And I would just view like the SMC and others' efforts on the trade unionists running for office as like one example. There could be more, but I don't want to like overload this and make this just like me pitching SMC. But I think that's the most concrete example of like that build, that my kind of mass politics vision that could have like a real world impact in the short term.
I'm very fascinated to see what comes of it. I do think program is like, I mean, I haven't been paying too much attention to convention so far, and maybe if I'm elected delegate tomorrow, I'll start paying I'll get in the forums, I'll start reading all the resolutions. But program definitely seems to be one of the buzzwords this year, and I always kind of feel like people define program really differently. That's what we do in every debate. It's always a little semantic argument, but definitely program seems to be the hot word. We're trying to figure out, what do we all agree on and believe in? Because if you asked me right now, I'd be like, a better world, and that's kind of it. And I don't know if I'm Medicare for all. I don't know if I could say what is the specific vision that we have. So I'm really curious about what that's up. And if you're a listener and you want to talk about convention and you feel like you have a completely opposite take to our comrade David here, please let us know, and we might feature you for a little. What's the phrase that no one likes? No one likes any of the defining words besides the ones they come up with themselves, is vanguardist attitude versus mass politics attitude, because everyone says they're doing mass politics. But the opposite perspective, please reach out to us.
Yeah. And I just want to say one more thing. I really appreciated what David said about how what we believe in has to be agreed upon democratically. And I think that we all believe in a lot of things. Trying to figure out democratically what our core values are will also should be tied into a strategy and a vision, both short, medium, and long term. But like, I just want to say, people in my own caucus and we don't even believe in the same kind of, like, I'm a one state solution person, but other people are still two state solution people, and I cannot believe it. So I'm just like, yeah, but like, guess what? We agree on some things, which is that everyone in what we'll call the Levant deserves human rights and deserve to live in a world where that is enforced as like a basic idea, and they don't live in that right now at all. I just think that, we come from different traditions with different values and different experiences, and that's our weakness is our strength as well. And finally, at the end of the discussion, we came up with the conclusion, which is it's not even our position to decide what that world would look like for the people of the Levant. It's for them to decide. So when it comes to foreign policy, there's what we sort of have our opinions on, and there's sort of like what matters politically in terms of our ability to sort of be part of an organization together. So a lot of these things are just sort of, these are my opinions, and these are like the things that I've read up on and I feel strongly about. But like, there's very few things where I think we need to move forward like this and have these red lines where I'm just like, I got to leave the org. Because ultimately, another great thing about DSA is that if there's something going on DSA and I don't agree with it, I'm going to keep doing the things I do agree with and that I do feel like are worth my time, because that is the beauty of the democratic socialist organization with the Big Tent.
I love the beauty of it. And I appreciate that we're still talking about Big Tent, because I think even as we start to veer into program, I think we start to get closer and closer to democratic centralism. And
Or just having a party program like
sympathetic
every
to
parties have to. I don't know about that. I mean, parties have programs. I mean, that's organizations
well,
have
every
programs.
party is, but parties are democratic centralist, you know?
I think you
in-
are
in
defining that
some
way too
ways.
broadly. I mean, is the
Maybe. I
Republican or
mean,
Democratic
I
Party
don't know if I
centrist?
would
No.
call the Democratic or Republican parties, to be quite
Okay.
fair. But like
Going
any
back
of
to
the
like,
European
we're all
political
throwing terms
parties,
and people are defining
you
them
know,
differently. But
I know, here we are again. Well, anyway, that's it from us. There's so much more that we could talk about, which is exciting. I'm glad we
Right,
have
this is just
so
the
many
start
people.
of the conversation.
Yeah, I can't wait to have more. We do have a couple of people coming on, hopefully very soon this month, to talk about other convention proposals. I've gotten a few folks who've reached out to me, and I'm very excited to do those proposals. And I think we'll finally have our first proper debate, because we'll have people saying yes on this resolution versus no on this resolution. And we'll have very clear arguments, which will be great. So I can't wait for that. But with that said, we're all still here, and we're going to have these discussions for the rest of the month. I'm Scott.
I'm Susan.
And
solidarity
solidarity
forever.
forever.